If you're watching this on YouTube, you might have noticed that this episode is a week delayed. But if you want to get early access to our episodes, consider becoming a paying member. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. Thank you for all your support. Richard Holloway is as enlightened and intelligent a bishop as you'll find anywhere. He's described himself as a post-Christian, even a recovering Christian. He was Bishop of Edinburgh and head of the Anglican Church of Scotland. I've had 2 or 3 encounters with him on an Edinburgh stage and have found each one a most stimulating and agreeable experience. I'm not sure of the date of this conversation, but I've just watched it all through to remind myself. Meeting of minds has become a bit of a cliché, but in this case, I describe it as an understatement.
Richard, welcome back to Edinburgh. I look back fondly to the conversation we had in the big tent in Charlotte Square about 3 years ago, I think. I think I want to begin with the human animal, presumably the only animal on the planet that's an object of interest to itself. And we might say that in us, the universe has become an object of interest to itself. And it's that kind of passion for understanding that's characteristic of our species and results in philosophy, science, theology. Because the presenting problem that I wrestle with, even though I've moved away from certain fixed wrestling positions, is the fact of the universe itself, the fact Leibniz put it, there's something and not just nothing. You too are in awe at the extraordinary nature of the universe, this planet that we live in. And I see that, it's, in a sense, as the root of all these human inventions of attempting to explain, arrive at an understanding of it. It's a queer business, though, isn't it, the universe?
Julian Huxley said, first of all, I should apologize for my voice. Quote that French thing, voici l'anglais avec son sang-froid habituel. Here is the Englishman with his habitual bloody cold. I'm getting over a cold and my voice may give out before the end of the evening, in which case Richard Holloway will have to do all the talking. Julian Huxley said, if I talk very quietly, maybe the microphone can pick it up. Will that? Thank you.
Voice of...
Something like, man is the universe become conscious of itself. And he also wrote a poem which begins, the world of things entered your infant mind to populate that crystal cabinet. And he went on to say, eventually, dead men could live there and converse with stars. All inside here. We internalize the universe. We put a model of the universe inside our heads. That's what we are privileged to do, and as you say, no other species even comes close to that. It is an enormous privilege to be allowed to understand, to revel in, to wonder at, to feel a sort of sense of humility in the face of the fact that the universe is so vast, and yet we can, by putting numbers on it, by poetry, by art, we can, in some sense, put a model of it inside our heads. I can't imagine a better way of spending my brief time in the sun than trying to do that.
Do you have the kind of mind? I mean, in many ways, the religious mind, William James said it was a sick mind. And I mean that in a kind of useful way, because there are sick, neurotic people, very often artists are, people who have a particular kind of sensitivity, anguish. There's a kind of mind that can't stop wondering about the factness of the universe. I mean, why there is something at all. And given that we have a kind of causal implant in the brain. We look for agency. It's understandable that people would posit reasons for the, and I'm not being theistic here in particular, I'm just trying to probe your mind as a scientist. Is there any form of words that can actually express the mystery of nothing giving birth to such a vast something?
Well, I suppose the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is that we are thinking about it. We are here. And we wouldn't be if there was nothing. So with hindsight, it's not particularly surprising. What is harder to grasp is the idea that from nothing, something could suddenly come. It's a thing that physicists wrestle with. By the way, can you hear me if I croak like this? Yeah. I couldn't possibly do justice to the way physicists talk about this, but it's something like, if you have an equal quantity of matter and antimatter, you get nothing. So if you start with nothing, you can, like that, you can somehow make an equal quantity of matter and antimatter. Now, that doesn't mean anything to me. There may be physicists here who can elucidate that. One thing I would say, however, is that no matter how difficult it is to understand how something came from nothing, whatever else you can say, it doesn't help to postulate a supernatural intelligence in order to solve that riddle. Because you might as well just postulate something as postulate a supernatural intelligence.
Supernatural intelligence? Could you postulate any other kind of intelligence? I mean,
no, I don't think you could. I mean, I think that to postulate some sort of quantum fluctuation, which gives rise by an inflationary process to the universe as we know it, is bad enough. But to postulate an intelligence would be to compound the problem a millionfold.
Take me then through enormous something comes from nothing. And within that continuum of something, we gradually emerge, including our intelligence. Now, is that sown, as it were, is that within the seed of actuality at the moment of the big inflation, the Big Bang?
I'm not sure about sown within the seed. I suppose that means, could it have been predicted at the moment of the Big Bang? I don't know what to think about that. I mean, a fully fledged determinist would say, well, everything could have been predicted in principle. I suppose that the biological part of that mystery, the part that takes us from the origin of the first self-replicating molecule, which probably happened between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago, from there to life and us and intelligence, is reasonably well understood, not fully understood, but reasonably well understood. That was the contribution that Darwin made and Darwin's successors. As to whether you think that was somehow inevitable, it would be nice to know, wouldn't it, whether it's happened more than once. Because the number of planets in the universe is billions of billions. And for all we know, it's only happened once, which means that we are a fantastically lucky accident. At least the start of life was a fantastically lucky accident. Thereafter, it followed a course which is pretty predictable in the sense that if, say, a meteorite were to hit, a large comet, say, were to hit the Earth and wipe out most of life, we could predict the kind of thing that would arise in the next 10 million years. So there is something predictable about evolution. But if this is the only planet where it's happened, then it's stretching it a bit to say it was that predictable, because it's only happened in one in a billion planets.
The last time we talked in public like this, we both puzzled about the emergence of pity. And you wrote a beautiful essay on your web page about that, because that does seem to run counter to many of the things that you would expect, natural selection, the kind of evolutionary dynamic, because here you have a species that begins to act apparently on occasions against its own best interests. You instance contraception, for instance. I think more of self-sacrifice, of heroism. The thing that keeps me within the religious enclosure, albeit right near the guy ropes at the very edge, is precisely because I think historically you could demonstrate that this apparent absurdity, the emergence of this particular challenge to human cruelty and indifference to the stranger, to others, has historically been associated with certain kinds of religious consciousness. I'm not defending them in the sense that it was a supernatural telegram from God, but there is something about the religious consciousness that I think has contributed to good ethical developments. And I'm just wondering whether you have any way in which you can affirm positively certain aspects of what religion has brought into the human experience historically.
When I mentioned contraception, that was not intended to be an example of kindness or pity, no. Of course. That was just an example of the way in which it's possible for humans to rebel against the dictates of natural selection and selfish genes. So if we can do it on a relatively crude level with contraception, the point I was making was, why shouldn't we do it with respect to other things? Now, we have sexual lusts, which we still have, even though we're using contraception. And we know perfectly well, therefore, that we are not fulfilling the dictates of the selfish genes. My suggestion would be that emotions like pity, sympathy, are also lusts which come from our evolutionary past and which may have no longer the same usefulness they once had. But thank goodness we still have them, in just the same way as our sexual lusts survive their usefulness, because when we use contraception, they're not doing their Darwinian thing. My Darwinian suggestion for pity is that it stretches back to a time when we lived in small bands, which were so small that everybody that you met would be a close relative, would be a clan member, would be a cousin, or would be a person that you're going to meet again and again and again. And therefore, from a purely cynical point of view, you could expect to get reciprocation. So natural selection at that time built into us the lust to be good, the lust to be nice to people, because in those days the genetic payoff was there. Nowadays the genetic payoff is not there because we no longer are surrounded by cousins. But just as our sexual lusts survive contraception, so our lust to be good and sympathetic survive moving out into big cities where there no longer is the Darwinian usefulness. That doesn't quite ring true enough to me. I still think that there's a need for more than that. But I think just as sexual lust can flower into the great poetry of John Donne and William Shakespeare, so the lust to be good, which originally was rather mundane, be good to your cousins, be good to potential reciprocators, can flower into the true nobility of goodness, which we know. And if you think about it, if natural selection were going to build into us a lust to be good, a lust to be sympathetic, empathetic, what would it actually feel like inside? Well, it probably would feel pretty noble. It would feel pretty exalted. And so when I said it didn't entirely satisfy me, I'm not sure that that's true. I think in the same way as Romeo and Juliet is in some sense the sort of poetic flowering from sexual lust, so the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath, is a similar flowering from the lust to be good, to be generous, to be forgiving.
My difficulty with that is, and I'm struggling quite to get it, do you think that it's all kind of horizontal, that it's all part of the kind of evolutionary progress of the thing, or are there any surprises? I mean, I remember when we talked before, I said I thought that certain things amounted to a moral singularity. There was something unexpected about them. I mean, what is the what's the adaptive value of art, of great poetry, of opera, of painting? In that sense, I mean, these flower.
I agree. Singularity is a good word, and I think that's right. I think that the human brain is a quite astonishing product of natural selection, which has completely taken off, like a rocket, way beyond what it was originally, I won't use the word intended for, but you know what I mean. I mean, beyond which natural selection shaped it. It's not too surprising that that should be the case. After all, electronic computers were originally designed as calculating machines, and without any additional redesign, it suddenly turned out that they were good at word processing. They could play chess, they could plan wars, they could indeed compose music and do art. So the word emergent property is a familiar enough word, and I have no problem with it.
Can we talk a bit about religion? And one of the things that I would like to suggest is, that there are such things as non-theistic religions, and that it is possible to be religious in a kind of non-theistic way. And the third thing is that theology is actually quite a sophisticated discipline, and there are ways of doing God talk that are closer to you than, say, to Jerry Falwell. There's a whole kind of negative theology tradition that says you cannot say what God is, only what God is not. And the reason why I welcome the kinds of books that you write is because of their cleansing of what I consider to be idolatrous versions of God, confident human projections. Do you allow for any nuanced subtleties in religion, because you're pretty kind of massive in your onslaught against it? Do you discriminate? I know there are some Christians you quite like, as well as some that you and I both cordially would wish the planet would relieve themselves of. But do you have any sympathy for the religious consciousness, which is trying to be honest, and is even hearing the challenging things that you say, and isn't rejecting them out of fear? There would have been a time 15 years ago when I would have been too afraid to have a discussion with you, because I was so uncertain and insecure in my own hold on metaphysical religion that I was afraid. I couldn't read Nietzsche 15 years ago. The thing that's happened is that I'm more interested in what I can grasp of the truth than defending any authoritative position. But I still find in religious communities, I still think of this as my family. I see lots of lovely things there. And I actually do see a way of using religion in a purely human way. Do you consider have you explored any of that?
Well, I think I have to ask you back, Richard.
Yeah.
But sort of clear the undergrowth a bit before we can talk further. I mean, what do you actually believe about God?
I don't. I'm between gods, in a sense. I don't believe in the God outside everything that is, the supernatural originating being. A bit of me, I'm probably not so much an agnostic as an unknower. And incidentally, I mean, one of the criticisms of your book made, for instance, by Anthony Kenny, the philosopher, is that the intelligent position is agnosticism rather than either theism or atheism, because you cannot know for certain either of those, but you can know that you don't know. I would say that I'm in a state of unknowing about the nature of ultimate reality and whether there is something that either was the agent of it or is somehow embedded within. You see, Spinoza talked about God or nature. It could be that the totality of everything is what some people might mean by this ultimate reality. So I find God talk uncomfortable, partly because it's used in such overconfident ways. And my own hold on Christianity is non-theistic in that sense. And there are quite a lot of non-theistic religions, and there are non-theistic Christians. There's a non-theistic branch of the Quakers. There's a non-theistic branch of the Unitarians. There are non-theistic Christians kind of sprinkled everywhere. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that they're atheists. They just don't use that rhetoric. But they retain a connection to the community of faith, a bit like Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, who calls himself a practicing but unbelieving Christian. And it seems to me that anyway, the essence of Christianity has always been about act, not about belief. I mean, Jesus himself, I think, was not interested in persuading people to have a piece of metaphysical software, but about getting a certain kind of response. And I continue to be a member of the Christian church because I'm for Jesus. So are you, because you wrote an essay called Atheist for Jesus. So we have Jesus in common. And theologians make a distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. The Jesus of history was this extraordinary man who we can talk about that. And you got this kind of theological development that gradually deified him and made him into a great kind of Byzantine emperor. So my position is eccentric, and since I'm not an evangelical about it, I don't need to persuade anyone else to hold it. What I'm interested in is finding out whether you look upon it with contempt and say an intelligent man like me shouldn't retain that.
No. It's very, very far from that. I think we're actually extremely close. First, technically, I'm an agnostic. I made this. I made this 7-point scale.
Yep, and you're 6.
I'm 6. Yeah. Where 1 is total confidence in God, and 7 is total confidence in no God, and I'm a 7. Well, maybe a 6.8 or something like that. However,
I'm a 5.5.
Okay. I qualify that by saying that there's an infinite number of things we have to be agnostic about. Mm-hmm. Fairies and angels and things. And so I wouldn't privilege any particular god over fairies or unicorns or anything like that. So I think that pretty much makes me a de facto atheist. Now, when you start using sort of pantheistic language, when you start quoting Spinoza, when you start talking about God as being the same as nature, then I think we have there's no difference between us. I think if you wish to use the word God for that, then I'm with you, except I think it's misleading because the great majority of people mean something very different. And the great majority of Christians do, because when you say that one can be a non-theistic Christian, I can see that you can, in the sense that you can be a great admirer of Jesus the teacher, Jesus the philosopher, Jesus the moralist. However, Christianity does seem to have certain existence claims about God, about Jesus being the Son of God, about Jesus redeeming our sins. If you throw all that out, there's not a lot of Christianity left, is there? Well,
you see, there's this magic little word myth. And I mean, I see Christianity as a beautiful myth. And the interesting thing about myth, it's more enduring than science. I mean, the Metamorphoses of Ovid, I can read with benefit today. I cannot read the Astronomy of Aristotle because it's over. Myth has enduring value. And if you look upon religion as essentially a series of stories of understanding, you like singing Christmas carols. And the myth of Christmas, I mean, has a kind of beauty. You don't have to buy the historicity of it. The tragedy in religion, this is Nietzsche's great point, the tragedy about religion is that the priests come along and they historicize myth. They turn it into fact, mean fact, instead of letting it be the glorious poetry of myth. So I go to church. I go to a church that's full of myth and mystery anyway, because I like kind of high opera worship because it appeals to the senses. And I can listen to these stories and myths, and they still teach me things. They still challenge me, because the question you ask about myth is not is it true or false, but is it living or dead? Is it still doing stuff? And so the Adam and Eve myth, the discontent of the Garden of Eden, I can still... it's stupid the way fundamentalists treat that as a historical narrative. They use the power of it.
But in that case, you would be perfectly happy to study the myths of any people in the world. And I mean, you would... Australian Aboriginal myths, the Dreamtime, beautiful myths, West African myths, Polynesian myths. I can appreciate that. I mean, I would love children to be taught the myths of the world. But by calling yourself a Christian, you're singling out one particular set of myths, rather than saying there are lots of myths that are beautiful and we can study them as poetry, as perhaps even containing some wisdom. But the moment you say, I'm a Christian, that's different.
I can like my own myth without dismissing others. You can only be in one place at one time.
No, but why do you say your own myth? I mean, you don't say that because you like a particular author, you can't like other authors.
Oh, sure, I'm not saying that, but I mean, this is the myth of my family. And there are lots of commonalities anyway in myth systems. I don't want to hammer it. I'm simply saying that it is possible to see religion as an entirely human construct, a work of the human imagination, which references back to as much about ourselves. All the horrible God stuff, there's a lot that's horrible about us. And I think that one of the good things about interrogating religious myth is it's a form of intense self-analysis in a way, because, I mean, we are the kind of creatures that have created these systems and structures and imaginative understandings. And it's just that at the end of over 40 years of wrestling with this stuff, I find myself comfortable in that kind of non-supernaturalist understanding of religion. I still want to identify myself with the family that's been good to me, and I still like being a member of that particular community, and this is the way I do it.
Okay, I can see that. So in the same way, say, I enjoy the poetry of W.B. Yeats, which is steeped in Celtic myth, fairies and all sorts of weird things, which in some strange way he probably believed in.
He did. He was a Rosicrucian.
Yes. Or you might enjoy Wagner, and so you resonate to Nordic myths, or you might enjoy Homer and resonate to Greek myths. And so in all those cases, you're getting some kind of poetic value out of it. But nevertheless, there's a certain loyalty to the one of your childhood, the Christmas carols, the Christmas crib, etc. Martin Rees, you quoted the Astronomer Royal. He's an unbelieving Anglican. Out of loyalty to the tribe is the phrase he uses. I got a certain loyalty to the Anglican tribe.
Were you a childhood Anglican?
Yes.
And were your parents fiercely Christian?
Oh, no.
Because people have wondered.
No. No, my parents, well, I say, they're still alive. They are non-believers, but they sent me to Anglican schools, and so I got the full works Not that the Anglican full works is very full when in comparison to competition. But yes, I've got a certain tribal loyalty. It's not very strong, but there's a sort of aesthetic liking for it.
What about the ethical bit? Because it's more for me than beautiful stories. It's also about personal challenge, because I think of Jesus as belonging to the prophetic tradition. There are extraordinary people thrown up in history by whatever processes that challenge the cruelty, the power dominance, the madness of humanity. And I think that they have enduring value, and they appear in different traditions. I think that Jesus made certain enduring challenges to human selfishness and cruelty, to religion, because one of his most dominant themes was that compassion trumped everything else.
Yes.
It trumped code. That's the meaning of the parable of the Good Samaritan.
I think that's true. But I mean, Jesus was one of several. I mean, you could talk about the Buddha, you could talk about Gandhi. There are various such figures who are inspiring. But somehow, because you happen to have been brought up Christian, to keep returning to Jesus because of that seems to me a rather inadequate reason to keep returning to Jesus rather than to talk about Buddha or Socrates or
I quite like
Bertrand
Buddha.
Russell.
I've done a wee bit. I do a wee bit of Buddha. I mean, I'm a kind of Buddhist, Quaker, Anglo-Catholic agnostic. I mean, you can't get much broader than that, Richard.
Richard Gregory, who's a great psychologist, said, when I was at Cambridge, one of my tutors was called Broad and the other was called Church. It sounds to me, though, as though this is a kind of special pleading. I mean, you like the idea of being a Christian, and so you bring it back to that at your intellectual level. And you could just as well make a case for being a Thorian or a Olympian.
Yeah, but what's wrong with doing that? I mean, why have this animus against a perfectly gentle person like me who's not doing too much damage on earth? Why can't you just lead me with my consoling fictions? I mean, why do you want to... what is it that
Richard,
you need
I can't think of anybody to whom I feel less animus than you. Yes, of course. I mean, that's absolutely right. But we're having an intellectual conversation, and I could, we could talk about any myth, and it doesn't seem to be that you've got a very strong reason for calling yourself a Christian.
Many don't. I mean,
no.
Yeah. Do you allow any space for consoling fictions? I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, one of the most astonishing of the Holocaust novels, The Last of the Just by Andrei Schwartz-Bart, about Ernie Levy, The Last of the Just. He's on his way in a boxcar to Auschwitz filled with children, most of them already dead. And he's got a little dead boy on his lap and his sister's sitting there. And the children gather around him and they've lost their parents. They're not sure what's happening. And he tells them a consoling fiction. He tells them that they are on their way to Jerusalem and they will be reunited. They're actually on their way to the gas chambers. And Golda, who's sitting beside him, looks at him and she realizes he doesn't believe a word of it. And he bites back at her and he says, there is no room for truth here. What would you have said to those children? I mean, I don't want to put you in the spot, but there is a sense in which for some people, that the consolation of the thought of eternal life, they've had a terrible existence down here, they're on the way to hell. What's wrong with a fiction that gives them comfort before the lights go out?
I think that, I would probably have said the same thing, I think. I think that there comes a point where human compassion just takes over. And I would probably have done the same thing. What I won't do, though, is do what some people seem to me to do, which is to say, because it's a comforting fiction, therefore it isn't fiction at all. So when we're not actually in the position of being in danger of shattering somebody's comforting illusion, when we're instead sitting in armchairs on a stage, just having a conversation, you won't stoop to saying, because it's comforting, that makes it fact. But many people would. There are many people who simply don't understand that to say that something is comforting or consoling doesn't make it true. And you'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but some people would be surprised how many people there are who somehow think that because something's comforting, it must be true, as though the universe owes us comfort.
But if some people do get comfort from it, I mean, Frank Sinatra said he believed in anything that got him through the night. I mean, and there are lots of people for whom religion, I mean, the opium of the masses, Marxist thing, I don't actually despise that. And I'm not certain enough about anything to know even that ultimately there's nothing beyond that to which it might ultimately refer. I think maybe that's a difference between us. I think you have a more settled mind on these things than I have. I'm in a state of kind of expectant unknowing.
About surviving death?
No, I'm not particularly interested in that.
Right.
But about the universe possibly meaning something other than an accidental collocation of atoms. Cannot demonstrate it one way or the other. But the extraordinary fact that we ourselves have a passion for meaning, invent meanings, make up fictions and all of that, it's because of our own extraordinary nature. A bit of me reserves the possibility that it refers to something other than simply...
Okay. I have no problem with understanding why the human brain would wish to see meaning in things. I mean, it seems to me to be fairly easy to understand that the human brain should be so constructed to survive that it would seek meaning and see pattern even when there isn't pattern there. So that doesn't worry me. As for the suspicion that there is more to the universe than we understand, I'm damn sure there's more to the universe than we understand. There's a hell of a lot more that we are going to understand in the next few hundred years. And there may be some things that we shall never understand. But I think I draw the line at saying because we don't understand it, therefore some kind of theistic interpretation is therefore plausible. I suspect that the truth, when and if we ever discover it, will be far grander and more mysterious than anything that theists have ever imagined.
That's not a bad place for us to turn to. Oh, you were? I wasn't sure if you were waving at us.
No. we can't see because we're completely... Could we have the lights up, do you think? Would that be possible?
Hi everyone, we've got a really exciting announcement. We want you personally to join us for 2 days of discussions and debate, all happening at the inaugural Dissident Dialogues 2024. This epic event will take place in Brooklyn on May 3rd and 4th. We will be joining leading thinkers such as Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, John McWhorter, Konstantin Kisin, Francis Foster, and so many more. We want you to join us for a gathering where absolutely everyone is part of the conversation. Conservatives, progressives, atheists, theists, left, right, and everything in between. Dissident Dialogues presents a rare opportunity to immerse yourself in a conversation with the most influential thinkers of our time. We will tackle important topics relating to religion, science, politics, and culture. So if you are driven by intellectual honesty, curiosity, and a desire for the truth, then Dissident Dialogues is definitely the place for you. This is not just an event, this is a beginning of an intellectual journey. And we want you to come along for the ride. Dissident Dialogues, a place for dangerous ideas. Buy your tickets now at dissidentdialogues.org and be part of the conversation.
So, you've got your programme up first.
At a previous debate, one of the people here categorised religious people in one of three categories: people who knew everything, people who knew nothing, and those that were essentially hypocrites who didn't believe in it but thought it was good to control the masses. I wonder if the speakers could comment on that categorisation.
Well, control. There's no doubt at all that Weber's thing about the routinization of charisma, that some prophet, some poet, some brilliant thing comes into the world and it blazes, and then when the person who brought it in is gone, the routinizers take it over and turn it into some kind of system which they defend as the system. And that clearly does happen in religion. I guess the clergy have dominated the Christian church for years, and they've been quite good at controlling. But there's always been a subversive tradition within those religions itself. So I don't think any one single definition of a very complex phenomenon, one as trite as that, is actually fair, because while it's true, it's not the whole truth.
There's a strain of anti-clericalism which suggests that somehow priests are sort of cynical manipulators who use religion for their own nefarious political purposes. I'm sure some of them do, but what I'm curious about is whether religions were designed with that purpose in mind. I suspect they weren't. I suspect they just grew up by some kind of mysterious evolutionary process. And then were later exploited by cynical priests.
All kinds of ideas about the natural selection operating on religion.
I know, yeah.
I mean, there are adaptive religions. I think some religions adapt to science, to modern ideas about the best way to run humanity, and you get some religions that refuse to adapt. I think that funny old Anglicanism has been a very adaptive religion. It's suddenly reverted to non-adaptive responses to the fact of homosexuality at the moment, which is deeply sad. But on the whole, it's chugged along with history and made changes.
Yes.
So,
you were talking about kind of overconfident religious people. Well, I'm very sad to report that we have an Edinburgh creation group here who spread lots of nonsense around about the community. I was wondering if what you think the threat from creationism and religious fundamentalism is in the UK, and what we should do about it.
I think it's growing. I think that there are importations from America, and oddly enough from Australia. I've heard lots and lots of horror stories from science teachers in Britain who tell me that increasing numbers of their pupils are young Earth creationists. That's to say, they believe the world is only 6,000 years old, which is just shocking, actually. It's truly shocking. Some of you probably heard me say this before, but it's not a small error. It's equivalent to believing that the width of North America from New York to San Francisco is 7.8 yards. 7.8 yards from one side of North America to the other. That's the scale of the error. And yet, significantly large numbers of school children in this country believe that, partly because of the rise of Islamic populations, I'm sorry to say. But I've noticed this. But it's not only that, it's also because of imports from America and Australia.
Following on from that, do you think religion gets in the way of appreciating humans as animals and studying them as such?
Appreciating humans?
As animals. And
as animals.
As animals, and what?
You're asking me that, yeah. Well, humans, of course, are animals, and we're not plants, and we're not fungi. Yet, we are rather special as well, of course. I think that there are... my voice is beginning to come back, isn't it?
I've had a miraculous effect.
Yes. I think that there is a tendency for humans to erect a wall around our species as though we are somehow so qualitatively different from all the rest of the animal kingdom that we deserve special moral consideration. For example, the abortion of a tiny 4-cell embryo is regarded as a more serious moment than the killing of an adult chimpanzee by many people. Well, that kind of speciesism could not survive a serious understanding of evolution. So, to the extent that religion has fostered the idea that there is something unique, qualitatively and utterly unique about humans, I think that the answer to your question is yes.
And I would like to agree with that. I think that the problem is that some of the scriptures, the book of Genesis, gives man dominion over all the other creatures of the earth. When the idea of the soul was developed, we had them, but animals didn't. And I think that that's given us permission to treat them in an intensely cruel way. And I think we in our generation probably have been more cruel than any previous generation because we treat them as product. I think the whole factory farming ethic is one of the moral scandals of our time. And I think you can relate quite a lot of that, both to religion and to people like Descartes, who created this absolute disjunction between us. I think that I don't want to get going on this. I was going to ask Aubrey about it, but I think that one of the greatest moral challenges to our species as moral animals is the way we treat other animals and do not even argue about our right to factory farm chickens, turkeys. I mean, the Bernard Matthews sheds, when there was that outbreak of disease a few years ago, and you saw into the Bernard Matthews sheds and those Suffolk farms, we crowd those creatures in there in a way that makes us, I think, the most cruel species on the planet.
Well, I agree with that. And coming back to what you were saying earlier, Richard, about the value of myth, and I mean, you just quoted Genesis. You somehow managed to pick and choose which bits of Genesis you take to be good and which bits you don't. So what is the value of myth if you decide on modern criteria which bits you're going to adopt and which bits you're going to reject as evil?
Because if you're an intelligent human being, that's what you do.
But why bother with the myth at all then? Why not just go straight for the moral?
Well, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that's perfectly valid, and I think that the thing about a lot of those old texts is that they are self-correcting, and that you do get challenges within the text itself against some of those particular readings. And I think you could say that there is a valid, gentle way of understanding that, because I think until a lot of modern farming methods, we did relate to other animals, we lived off them, we slaughtered them. I'm not a vegetarian, but we did it in a kind of a more humane way, that we lived alongside them. We didn't kind of treat them as product.
So I think,
I think you can take from that. You can develop an ethic of husbanding animals in an appropriate way. I think it's actually that the market economy has distorted our relationship with these other creatures.
Hello, it's for Richard Dawkins. I read Alison McGrath's book, God Delusion, The Dawkins Delusion. I'm just wondering if you admit any mistakes that you made in hindsight with your book, and also with regard to how does it make you feel being labelled an atheist fundamentalist?
When you say mistakes, what are you thinking of?
He alluded to you sort of taking things from the internet, historical, factual, theological mistakes.
I have no doubt. I mean, everybody makes a few mistakes. I've no doubt you can find some mistakes. I don't think they're very fundamental ones. As for being called a fundamentalist, I repudiate that utterly. A fundamentalist is somebody who absolutely knows what's right because it's written in a holy book. I don't know what's right because it's written in a holy book. I know what the evidence supports, and I know that if new evidence were to come in, that would support some other point of view, I would change my mind in a heartbeat. That is not what a fundamentalist does.
There's a gentleman over here. Sorry, it's very difficult. There's an awful lot of faces here.
My question is for Richard Holloway mainly, which is in terms of what you were talking about 15 years ago, that you felt deeply uncomfortable with Nietzsche. Would you say that in one sense that's because if you stripped away the historicity of Christ, there's actually quite a similarity between Nietzsche and Christ if you took them at the time in terms of challenging that type of clerical attitude to the church, and the thought is actually just as challenging if you went back 2,000 years as if you went back 150 to Nietzsche.
Say that again. And
if we take, for example, another aspect of it, which you talked about, the comforting aspects of myth, if you read quite a lot of, or at least some parts of what Christ said, it's not very comforting in terms of separating families and bringing a sword and dividing and challenging the religion at that stage. If you looked at certainly the Pharisees and how they're portrayed in the Bible, that it's just as challenging to a church-based society in terms of what happened 2,000 years ago as Nietzsche saying God is dead 150 years ago.
I see what you're getting at. No, I agree, because I think that one of the astonishing things about Jesus was precisely his challenge to the way institutions, ideas, idolatrize themselves. The whole point, I don't want to preach a wee sermon, but the whole point of the parable of the Good Samaritan is that it was not about religious hypocrisy, it was about religious righteousness. The guys that passed the man who'd fallen among thieves did it for valid religious reasons. And what Jesus was saying was, if you hold your religion too intensely and in that way, it gets in the way of your neighbor. Because compassion trumps the fact you can't touch that guy because your religion tells you he might be unclean. If he's dead, he's certainly unclean. And that, to me, is the most radical dissolvent of all purely doctrinal understandings of religion. And I think that, to me, basically, Christianity is an absolute ethic. And I think that Kierkegaard got this right as well. It's about a way of doing and being rather than holding something. I say to people, to me, Christianity is not a noun, it's a verb. It's not a faith that you can hold and then lose, because I've been accused of losing mine. It's a journey, it's a way of being, it's a way of traveling. And it means discarding a lot of stuff, because constantly you accrue phony ideas, idolatries, hatreds and cruelties. And I think that Christianity is being called upon today to drop, it took 2,000 years to drop its wrong attitudes towards women. And it's wrestling with its attitudes towards gays. And it seems to me that you're absolutely right that Nietzsche and Jesus just challenged that kind of static thinking.
My question's for Richard Holloway. You described yourself rather splendidly as a Buddhist, Quaker, Anglo-Catholic agnostic. But if I picked you up correctly, you also said you don't really believe in a supernatural God. You see Jesus really as an admirable character. You see church going as a sort of act of family celebration. You see religion as a source of comfort. You don't particularly believe in an afterlife. And you see religion as a product of the human imagination. Well, I'm an atheist. I could agree with all of that. So I'm just wondering... I'm just wondering in what sense, Richard, you wouldn't say that you're an atheist. I was still really struggling with that a little bit. It seemed to come down to a sort of fairly nebulous sense that, there must be something more than this. And I think a lot of Christians share that. It just seems to me a very flimsy basis for a lifetime of religious observance.
I'm not an atheist because I don't have certainties, and that atheism strikes me as a certain position, just as certain kinds of theism. I mistrust certainties. Certainties crucify people. And I think that the more doubt and love there is in the world, the more human plenitude and good feeling there will be. I'm not trying to universalize my own position. I'm not saying to anyone, be what I am. It's when people ask me, because I've been in the Christian ministry for a very long time, I was a bishop, I've studied theology and philosophy. They can't account for where I am. I just refuse to be categorized and told, therefore you cannot be a Christian. There are people who say that of me. Maybe I'm not a Christian. I'm not particularly interested in the label, but I do still want to be a member of that family because I love much of what it stands for, and many of the people and the community to which I belong, I see as part of my family, a kind of mad mixture of people, some doubters, some believing things that I can't. I think it is possible to have an understanding of Christianity that's non-supernatural. I don't want to universalize that. Many of the people I sit beside in the pew do clearly supernaturalize it. I don't, because it seems to me, I don't think there is an outside to things. I think everything is inside, and I think religion is inside. And I think that it is possible to hold religion in that kind of a way. It's quite difficult to make it into a gospel, to go at the street corner, because in many ways it's far too subtle. And it may be that people would say that it's someone certainly on his way out of religion. But I did go out of religion. I was so horrified by the last Lambeth Conference, 1998, which turned into a kind of hate fest against gay people, that I walked away for a bit. I gave up the bishoping and I went off and I took a kind of sabbatical from religion. And then I said to myself, this still holds important truths and values for me. I refuse to exile myself totally. I gradually found my way back in a way that I find has a kind of conscientious integrity. I think that the mistake that a lot of religions make is that they make these absolute truth claims that they think they have to force other people to believe. I'm not doing any of that. I'm simply being odd, eccentric me.
Richard, do you want to comment?
Well, I mean, Richard, you're clearly an agnostic, and I don't. I mean, so you're an agnostic who likes the Christian label for reasons of sentimental personal history.
No, that's too flippant.
Sentimental is not meant to be a pejorative word.
No, I mean, I was equating you with the Astronomer Royal, a man for whom I have the highest regard.
Yeah.
And would you put yourself in the same position as him, a non-believing Anglican?
Certainly in a doctrinal sense, but I mean, I find ways of using doctrine, understanding doctrine in a non-supernatural way. But to me, the essence of Christianity is not just about sentiment, it's about moral challenge. And I think that that's the enduring thing about Jesus for me. There are other prophets that do it, but this is the prophet I've chosen to follow. This is the community that we wouldn't have the memory of Jesus if it hadn't been for Christianity. It carries that dangerous memory through history, continuing to challenge people. And I got challenged by it as a boy. It's the bit that endured. It's the bit that took. I like beauty. Dostoevsky said we'd be redeemed by beauty. And it was beauty in a sense that took me into church. It wasn't doctrine, didn't understand all that, but I liked the drama of the liturgy. And that still works for me in a way, although the church I go to has very long services, and I sometimes get very impatient with that. But what I go to, in a sense, constantly to be challenged by the prophet Jesus is absolute focus on the way we create institutions, ideas, systems that get in the way of our humanity. We create political systems, economic systems, religious systems, and that radical challenge, I think, is simply unbudgeable for me. And I belong to the community that grew out of that. I think if Jesus were here today, he would be agreeing with a lot of what we're saying, but he'd probably ask us some probing questions about our lives too.
But he surely wouldn't think that he had died for our sins. I mean, that's a horrible idea, isn't it?
He probably wouldn't put it that way, but you could say our sins killed him, in the sense that it was human cruelty that did him in.
The essence, the fundamental doctrine of Christianity is that Jesus died to redeem us from our sins.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's part of theological evolution. But I already said to you, there's a difference between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith.
Yes, and that is the difference.
And it took about 400 years to get all that package of doctrine completed.
I want to move on.
Yep.
There's a gentleman in the Back row.
Good evening. It's great to speak to both of you, especially Mr. Dawkins there. Can I just get away from Jesus, the church, etc., etc.? When we go back to where we actually come from, where do we come from? And it all goes back to cells. There's just one thing that I've really expected you to come out with, but you haven't come out with. That when you come down to the cells in the soup, etc., etc., what occurs to me is, the big question is, how did it actually begin? How did these two cells come together and reproduce? I've never heard you come up with the theory of chaos. Chaos is an actual theory. Out of disorder comes order. I was asking you, why, or do you think, is that a possible theory? The theory of chaos between two cells coming together.
I think there's no suggestion that the origin of life was the coming together of two cells. The image there is a sexual image, and sex is certainly a much later invention. The origin of life, we don't know how it happened, but we know the kind of thing it was. It was the origin of the first genetic molecule in the broad sense, the first molecule that made copies of itself. And nobody knows how that came about. It was a phenomenon of chemistry. Chemists are working on trying to find possible models for how it might have happened, so far without success. It may have been a very, very, very improbable event indeed. I alluded earlier to the fact that there are at least 1 billion planets in the universe, probably, and we don't know whether life has originated on more than just this one. If life has originated only on one planet among those billion, then the kind of event we're looking for as the origin of life would be so improbable as to go far, far beyond what we ordinarily would call impossible. But with hindsight, because we are here, it nevertheless provides a perfectly satisfying explanation for our existence. I don't, as a matter of fact, think it was that improbable, which is exactly the same as to say I believe that there is life on many planets all around the universe. But I still don't know how it came about. It may be we shall never know, but I suspect that we'll probably get rather better theories than we have at present.
This is a kind of a question for Richard Dawkins. You sort of alluded earlier to understanding that a religious belief could come about. Given that religions appear to have been on the go for many thousands of years, what biological significance do you think is there for religion to arise? Because it looks like maybe it's some kind of biological, psychological necessity. And there was a second point, that is, you were discussing myth earlier and myth changing. Well, surely scientific exploration is exactly myth by another name, because you change it to suit the new facts.
Well, to take the second point first, it certainly is not that, because it changes to suit the new facts. Myths don't change to suit the new facts. I mean, science does change as new evidence comes in, but science is very strictly evidence-based, and I would strongly dispute any suggestion that science is just another myth. It certainly isn't that. Your first question was, where does religion come from in the first place? I suppose you could probably make some sort of a Darwinian case for the improvement of religion, where improvement strictly means improvement in its spreadability, in its popularity. So some religions survive and others don't. Some religious ideas survive in the climate of religious ideas and others don't. You can make a kind of quasi-Darwinian story out of that, not a genetic story. We probably do need a genetic story, however, for the psychological predispositions that lead us to be religious. When I say us, all human cultures, as far as I know, have some kind of religion. I think the way I would look at it is that there are psychological predispositions, analogous to what I was talking about, the lust for sex, the lust for goodness. There will be other kinds of such lusts, other kinds of psychological predispositions, which will not be in themselves religious, but which will predispose us to become religious under the right conditions. I'm thinking of things like the tendency to obey authority, the tendency to believe what you're told by wise elders of your society, which clearly has survival value. And I think a byproduct of that is likely to be the passing down through generations of beliefs which, after they've been going for a sufficient length of time, become traditional, become myths, and become religions.
Lady here.
Hi. I've got two questions. The first one is about God and the second one about religion. My first question is, I was wondering what your opinions on Pascal's wager was, whether or not you thought it was worthwhile believing in God, because you might as well, because I'm sure you know about Pascal's wager. The second question is about religion. And not everyone is sitting in an armchair looking for an intellectual discussion. And religion, I think, for many people, supplies a sort of stability to their lifestyles. And belief can be a very strong thing in this. I mean, I've read about cases where such belief in God has, say, cured cancer miraculously with no scientific explanation. I was wondering, this is to Richard Dawkins, in an ideal world, if you were to get rid of religion as you wanted to and everyone was to become atheist, what would you replace this religion and this belief with?
I make that three questions, is it?
Sorry.
Richard Holloway, what Pascal's wager? I'm not sure I know what Pascal's wager was.
It's betting on the possibility of God, and it goes like this: if you win everything, and if you lose, there's nothing to lose. So bet on the possibility of God. I prefer another existentialist approach, which in many ways I occupied for quite a long time. This is the Castilian philosopher Unamuno, who said that if it is nothingness that awaits us, then let us so live that it will be an unjust fate. In other words, religion as a kind of defiance. And I actually quite like that. I quite like kind of defiant, pointless, romantic gestures like that. The idea that you actually will choose almost against the facts. I believe because it's absurd. There's a certain kind of defiance in that. I choose to live as though there were that which we call God and it were all loving or all compassionate. There's a certain kind of existentialist romantic thing in that. And in a sense, it's the last ditch that a theist can be put into because evidence does not affect it. You simply choose even against the evidence because you'd rather be gloriously wrong than meanly right. A bit of me still gets the old claymore out and pops into that ditch. But as far as the positive values of religion, we all know there have been various studies done of the fact that I remember reading a study in a New York hospital that people who believed and prayed got over eye surgery more quickly than people who didn't. That doesn't prove anything except that if you believe certain things, it can actually help you through eye operations. It doesn't prove the truth of what you believe. But it may be quite a good thing if you've got a cataract operation coming up.
I'd like to say something about Pascal's wager. Mm-hmm. What if you follow Pascal's wager and you get to heaven and you discover it's not the God you thought it was, but Baal? You bet on the wrong God. That's one point. Another point would be, what makes you think that what God really, really wants you to do is believe in him? Maybe what God really wants is for you to be good or honest or sincere or kind. Why do we have this obsession with the idea that God wants you to believe in him, and therefore Pascal's wager says you should believe. Why not say, well, I don't necessarily believe in God one way or the other, but I'm going to be a really, really good person? Wouldn't that be a better way of implementing something like Pascal's wager?
I once read a little a theologian from Birmingham agonizing about God, stopped at a traffic light on a wet, miserable night, and she heard God saying to her, "It doesn't bother me at all if you don't believe in me.
Yeah.
Get on with your life."
Quite, yeah.
All I wish to say is I think we've had tonight, and you've taken part in it, a very good demonstration of how wonderful the human brain is. I mean, the human brain, something which is able to contemplate what it is itself. That is a unique and wonderful thing. And I think we've seen it interpreted here, these ideas, through two very humane persons. Whatever else we'd say, I think we've seen that tonight. It's been a great evening. I forget what its title was, God, Religion, or something like that. But we've had it in spades. Will you join me in thanking them for giving us a very splendid evening?
Eat stress-free this spring with Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals. Every fresh, never frozen meal is chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. Also, discover more than 60 add-ons every week, like breakfast, on-the-go lunch, snacks, and beverages to help you stay fueled and feel good all day long. Head to factormeals.com/reality50 and use code reality50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box. That's code reality50 at factormeals.com/reality50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box while your subscription is active. What are you waiting for? Get started today and fuel up for your springtime goals.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.